The cabin door creaked shut behind her, sealing away another empty evening. Emma traced the edge of her wedding ring, the gold dull under the gray twilight. 3 months, 2 weeks, 4 days, that's how long Alex had been gone this time, deployed overseas, his texts sporadic, his voice a ghost on the rare calls that connected. She used to count the days with hope. Now, she counted them like a sentence. The house breathed around her, too large for one person. She flicked on the kitchen light, illuminating the half-finished crossword from yesterday, the unwashed coffee cup, the silence. Friends had stopped asking her to gatherings months ago. "You're always so sad lately," they'd say, as if grief were a switch she could flip off. Even the mountains outside, once a solace, now felt like a barricade. Then, the storm came. Rain lashed the windows as Emma trudged up the overgrown trail behind the cabin, her hood pulled tight. She needed air that didn't smell like loneliness. The forest was slick with October chill, the pines shuddering under the wind. That's when she heard it, a low, pained groan, half drowned by thunder. Her pulse spiked. 20 yards ahead, a massive black bear lay crumpled in the mud, its fur matted with blood. A gash split its flank, raw and glistening. "Run," screamed every instinct. But the bear's eyes locked onto hers, dark, intelligent, terrified. It whimpered. She froze. Against all reason, Emma knelt. The bear flinched but didn't lash out as she tore a strip from her flannel, pressing it to the wound. Its breath was hot on her wrists. "Shoo," she murmured, as if soothing a child. The absurdity hit her. Here she was, risking her life for a wild thing when she could barely muster the will to microwave dinner. Yet as the bear's muscles relaxed under her touch, something in her chest loosened too. Dusk fell by the time she staggered home, soaked and shaking. She left the back door open, just a crack. That night, for the first time in months, she dreamed of warmth. The next morning, Emma woke with the taste of copper in her mouth, fear, or guilt, or something else entirely. She told herself she wouldn't go back. But by noon, her hands were stuffing the first aid kit with antiseptic and gauze, her boots retracing yesterday's steps through the sodden underbrush. The bear was gone. Only a dark stain in the mud marked where it had lain. Her stomach dropped. Then, a twig snapped. He stood between the trees, massive and watchful, his breath frosting the air. The wound on his flank had clotted into an angry scab. Emma held her ground, arms trembling at her sides. This is madness, but when the bear huffed, almost a sigh, and lumbered closer, she didn't run. "Easy," she whispered, as he sniffed the medical supplies. His nose was velvet rough against her palm. She dressed the wound in silence, her fingers steady now. The bear flinched only once, a rumble building in his chest, but when she murmured, I know," he stilled. Up close, his fur was sun-warmed, threaded with silver. She named him Silas, something old, something solid. Days blurred. She brought meat scraps, apples pilfered from town. Silas waited for her now, his presence a quiet certainty Alex's sporadic calls could never match. She talked to him, about the husband whose voice grew fainter each week, about the way the cabin's walls seemed to press closer every night. Silas listened, his dark eyes reflecting her face back at her, twisted and small. Then came the afternoon she found him standing in the creek, water sluicing off his shoulders. Emma crouched on the bank, hugging her knees. "Do you ever miss your own kind?" she asked. Silas turned. For a heartbeat, she swore he understood. He waded toward her, sending ripples across the surface, and pressed his muzzle to her knee. Her breath caught. The contact burned, not with pain, but with something worse, recognition. That night, she dreamed of hands that weren't hands, of being held by something that could destroy her. She woke gasping, her skin feverish. At dawn, she stood before the mirror, tracing the dark crescents under her eyes. Her phone buzzed, "Alex, finally." Asterisk, 2 more months, then I'm home for good. Asterisk, the words should have been a lifeline. Instead, they coiled like a noose around her throat. Emma hurled the phone onto the bed. Then she grabbed the raw steak from the fridge and strode into the woods, the trees swallowing her whole. The forest smelled of damp earth and iron as Emma crashed through the undergrowth, the stake's blood seeping through the paper in her grip. Her pulse roared in her ears, not from exertion, but from the image still scorched behind her eyelids, Alex's text, those cheerful letters that now felt like an indictment. 2 more months of pretending. 2 more months of this gnawing, clawing emptiness. Silas emerged from the birches like a shadow given form. He was waiting. Always waiting. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. She tossed the meat onto a flat rock, watching as he devoured it with slow, deliberate bites. His pink tongue licked a streak of blood from his muzzle. Emma's stomach twisted, not with disgust, but with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "You'd never leave me, would you?" The words slipped out unbidden. Silas lifted his head. In the dappled sunlight, his eyes were almost human, knowing, patient. A low rumble vibrated in his chest as he stepped closer. Emma didn't retreat. His hot breath fanned her cheek as he sniffed her hair, her neck, the hollow of her throat where her pulse fluttered wild as a trapped bird. When his rough tongue swiped the sweat from her collarbone, she gasped. The sound seemed to startle them both. Silas jerked back, ears flattening. For one terrible second, Emma saw herself reflected in his black pupils, disheveled, feverish, wanting. The snap of a branch shattered the moment. Emma whirled to see Tom Higgins, the game warden, standing frozen on the trail 10 yards away. His rifle wasn't raised, but his hand hovered near the strap. "Emma?" His voice was carefully neutral. "That's a mighty big friend you got there." Silas growled, the sound like boulders grinding together. Emma instinctively stepped between them, arms spread. "He's harmless." The lie tasted bitter. Tom's eyes darted from her to the bear and back again. "Folks been reporting a black bear getting too comfortable near town." "You been feeding him?" Her silence was answer enough. Tom sighed, rubbing his beard. "Emma, you know this ain't right. That's a wild animal. And with Alex coming home soon, don't." Her voice cracked. "Don't bring him into this." Tom studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I'll give you till sundown to say your goodbyes. Then I'm coming back with a tranquilizer team." He tipped his hat and retreated down the path, leaving Emma standing there, her whole body trembling. Silas nudged her hand with his nose. She looked down at him, at this creature who had become her confessor, her solace, her sin. The tears came then, hot, furious, final. "We have until sunset," she whispered. The bear leaned into her touch, and Emma made her choice. The creek swallowed Emma's phone with a muted plunk. She watched the water ripple, then still, as if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't just severed her last tether to the world beyond these woods. 3 days passed in a fever dream. She stopped going into town. Stopped checking the mailbox. The cabin filled with the sour tang of unwashed dishes and the metallic bite of loneliness, but she barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to the spaces between trees, to the rhythm of Silas's breathing when she pressed her forehead against his side. On the 4th morning, she found the feathers. A scatter of goose down clung to the brambles near their clearing, white tufts stained pink. Emma's stomach lurched. Further on, a mangled carcass lay strewn across the moss, bones gleaming wet in the dawn light. Silas watched her from the shadows, his muzzle dark with blood. This was nature. This was what he was. She should have been repulsed. Instead, a strange pride unfurled in her chest. He was magnificent in his brutality, unapologetic in his hunger. Not like her, choking on polite words and empty rooms. "You're beautiful," she whispered. Silas stepped into the light. Something in his gaze had changed, sharper, more intent. When he approached, Emma held her ground. His nose bumped her collarbone, damp and hot. Her breath hitched. Then his teeth grazed her throat. Not hard enough to break skin. Just enough to sting. Emma went rigid. For one dizzying second, she saw herself through his eyes, soft, fragile, prey. The realization struck like lightning, she had never been in control. She stumbled back, her pulse rabbiting against her ribs. Silas didn't follow. He simply watched as she fled, the forest swallowing her whole. The cabin door slammed behind her. Emma sagged against it, her fingers flying to the tender spot on her neck. The mirror showed a red mark blooming under her jaw. Not a wound. A warning. That night, Alex's truck crunched up the gravel drive. Emma watched from the window as he climbed out, his uniform crisp, his smile tentative. He held a bouquet of grocery store roses. "Surprise," he called. "They gave me early leave." She should have been happy. She should have run to him. Instead, her eyes strayed to the tree line. A shadow moved there, massive, silent. Watching. Alex followed her gaze. "Everything okay?" Emma touched her throat. "Yeah," she lied. "Just thought I saw something." She took the flowers. Their petals were already browning at the edges.